and get started because I want to make sure Maggie gets as much time as possible. Welcome. I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and you've joined us for one of the project briefing sessions on the first day of week 3 of our fall 2020 virtual member meeting. Week 3 is devoted to developments around technology, infrastructure, standards, and related matters. A couple of logistical things. I want to just mention that with week 3, we are not only doing live sessions, but we've released a number of pre-recorded videos, and I'd invite you to enjoy those as your time and interests permit. We are recording this session and it will be subsequently available both to meeting attendees and then to the general public. There is closed captioning if you'd like to make use of that. There is also a chat and feel free to use that as we go along. There's a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen and you can ask questions there. We'll deal with all the questions at the end of the presentation, but you can put them in at any time. Diane Goldenberg-Hart from CNI will come back at the end of the presentation and moderate the Q&A session. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Professor Maggie Melo from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Information and Library Science. She's an assistant professor and is also directing the Equity in the Making Lab. And she's going to report on some preliminary findings from a National Science Foundation funded grant that she received this summer, dealing with how to make makerspaces more equitable, more welcoming to a greater diversity of undergraduates, and what factors influence this and can improve it. And as with a few other folks in the research enterprise, I think when she first conceived this project, she was dealing with a somewhat different world and has had to go through some very adroit adaptation, and we'll probably say a little bit about that as she goes along too. So I'm delighted to welcome Maggie. Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Cliff. And once again, welcome everyone to the project debrief today, which is entitled Investigating the Spatial Arrangements of Makerspaces and its Impact on Diverse Populations. And of course, before getting started, I want to extend gratitude to the National Science Foundation for supporting this research program. All right, so an overview of this debrief. There are some key elements that I want to make sure that we cover. The first is to provide some context around the project design and also the current status, what it is looking like at the moment in terms of its kind of early stages of project deployment. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about some of the early preliminary findings. And when I mean early, I really want to emphasize that it's pretty preliminary and the project is really in its infancy. And then we'll kind of just round the debrief out by closing by talking about next steps for the project and then opening it up for questions and answers, which I have allocated about 10 minutes for. Okay, so that's the overview. Now, in terms of some of the context surrounding the project. Now, this research program focuses on this right here. Let me turn on my laser pointer here. At the threshold of a makerspace. Now, I've been working in or with makerspaces for the past 7 years, and it's pretty common to see these behaviors, a certain behavior happening at the threshold. You'll notice that a student will walk up to the doorstep, look inside, and then in a matter of moments decide it's not for them and they walk away. Now, for an outsider, this behavior may seem pretty trivial or pretty commonplace, right? Someone just walked in and walked away. But as a researcher who has been embedded in makerspaces and other STEM-rich learning environments, the threshold has become a really generative site for inquiry. As a researcher, I'm interested in what's happening in those moments, right? What everyday life information seeking practices are students, particularly undergraduates in this research program, what decisioning are they making at that moment to decide whether to go in or not? So as I'm doing this research, I recognize that this narrative or these behaviors are not unique to me, but is a behavior that happens across the hundreds of makerspaces across the US. So this research program seeks to understand a couple of major things. Number one is trying to investigate how a makerspace spatially communicates to undergraduates, specifically undergraduates from underrepresented communities, who belongs in the makerspace and also who doesn't. How can they at the threshold kind of identify the values of the space, the audience for the space, and also the purpose of the space? So that's a major piece of it, getting an understanding of those decisioning. The other bit of it, as alluded to, is how a space, a makerspace, is configured spatially to communicate that messaging. And I'm talking about like macro features, looking at the technologies in place, to also down to the micro features, thinking about like the wall color paint, to what you hear in the makerspace and also what you smell as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that's the context governing this research program. Now, pulling us up about like 3,000 feet and looking at the project design, this is how the context distills into a research question for this project. So the question is this: why do marginalized undergraduate populations turn away at the threshold of a university makerspace? So there are two kind of entry points that we're examining this question. First, of course, is through the deployment and application of theory. We're looking at from these three knowledge domains, from STEM equity, ELIS theory, everyday life information seeking practices, and makerspaces and spatial equity. So this question is really examined through the prism of these theories together, but also separately. Now, of course, there's also the project piece of it. What will we be doing for the next 5 years? So this research program is carved into 3 different phases, and each phase has an aim: aim 1, aim 2, and aim 3. And so for this project debrief, we'll spend a lot of time on aim 1 because that is where the project currently is. But I want to talk about the project holistically so we could see the larger kind of puzzle and how these pieces fit together. All right, so the research question, right? We are trying to examine why students turn away at the threshold of a university makerspace. And so the first question that needs examination is, well, what is a university makerspace? So in the first phase of the project, we are interviewing makerspace leadership across the UNC system. So there are 17 institutions within this network, and we identified makerspace leadership within this network, and we have been interviewing them for 2 months. Well, interviews are done. We've interviewed them with the intent to figure out and be in conversation with them to answer one question for this phase. What are the defining features of a university makerspace? Not only what you see, but also what do you smell? What do you hear as well? So that's for phase 1. We want to get that baseline understanding of what a university makerspace is. So the data generated from phase 1 will then feed into phase 2. For phase 2, we're going to take all of those features after we analyze them, and we are going to build out a virtual reality makerspace. And so the intent for this makerspace is to provide a consistent baseline for participants to navigate. I need to take a step back. So what are they navigating? Well, once this virtual reality makerspace is built out, we are going to have participants, undergraduates from underrepresented communities. We're going to invite them to engage with this VR makerspace and think aloud their impressions, their thoughts, and their feelings while being in that space. So if you can imagine an undergraduate student, we put on their HTC Vive headset, and then right away they're presented with a makerspace that's maybe about 20 feet away. And as they're approaching this virtual makerspace, we'll prompt them to stop, and then we'll begin asking Think Aloud protocol questions. Looking at the makerspace, what catches your attention? What do you think happens in this environment? What do you think the values are or the audience is? And so having that data collected from undergraduates experiencing this baseline makerspace will then in turn offer us insight in regards to how a makerspace communicates inclusion and communicates who belongs, but also it'll give us an opportunity for participants at the spot to provide potential design interventions. So we'll also ask them, what is it that is available in a makerspace that communicates the sense of inclusion for diverse communities? Also, what parts of the makerspace don't, and what parts are missing as well? So aim 1, aim 2 will then culminate in aim 3, which we then at UNC Chapel Hill build out and redesign one of the makerspaces with the data collected and analyzed from the first 4 years of the project. Okay, so that is a very kind of like high level overview of the project. And now what I want to do is spend more time talking about where we're at with the project. So in terms of our current status, just to reiterate some points that Cliff made briefly, this is part of an NSF career award, which means it spans across 5 years. So those 3 phases will be happening across 5 years. The directorate that it is in Education and Human Resources. And when I said that it is a project in its infancy, it really is. The project was awarded in late June, and the project began in early July. And since then, we have been able to launch the Equity in Making Lab, which I get to work with 2 incredible PhD students, very brilliant, smart, and sharp, Kimberly Hirsch and also Laura March. And we have been conducting the interviews and doing data collection and analysis at this moment. And also, as Cliff mentioned, COVID-19. Wow, what a time to put in an application or to apply for any type of funding right now. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it during this debrief, but I highly encourage you, if you're interested to talk about it or have a sounding board, I'd be happy to be that person, because the application process was different. And yeah, I would love to talk to you more about that if that's of interest. Now, a little bit finer point before landing onto the findings. Okay, the interviews. As mentioned, we interviewed Makerspace leadership within the UNC system. We identified them through purposive sampling. So it was a way for us to target specific folks that are in the makerspace and also have some connection with this kind of day-to-day operation. And of course, the question we asked them across the board was, what are the defining features of a makerspace? Of the 17 institutions, we fortunately were able to chat with 15 of the institutions. And at this current moment, we have coded and began to analyze 9 of the 15. So once again, these findings are still rather early. Now, in terms of how the collection and analysis has been unfolding, we have been doing something I haven't done before, collaborative coding. Yeah, I've usually done it before, but I have a stellar team and we're working through Max QDA, a software program. Would love to chat with folks more if they're interested in that. And since then, since July, we have developed a weekly cadence of checking in, discussing the memos that we have written as we've been coding, and also engaging in discussions around codes to collapse, to expand, and all that. So that is where we are currently, which is also a long way for me to say that, once again, these findings are really early. Okay, so let's talk about the findings. The first bit I want to talk about are kind of the fundamental findings that were important for this research program. So as you remember, for the second phase of the project, we are building out a VR environment of a conventional makerspace. Now, in order to do that, we really needed to have a 360 idea of what folks saw in the space, but also what they could smell and also what they would hear. Okay, so to prime participants for this question, we started out the interview by saying this. Now, I want you to imagine that it's September 2019, so we are pre-COVID, and you are at a generic university in North Carolina, and as you're walking around campus, you come across a room. And as you get closer to the room, you recognize that it's a makerspace. What do you see in the room, and how could you tell it is a makerspace? And so this question frames the interview guide, but it also helps us to get right away what their first impressions are. And so in terms of sight, almost automatically for all makerspace leaders, tools were readily available. They saw tools, they saw machines, and also probably to no one's surprise, in terms of folks that are working with makerspaces, a 3D printer across the board. Now, I will come back to this because there were a handful of folks that did say that there's a 3D printer, but were very reluctant to say that one existed in that space. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. So you saw a lot of tools, and alongside the tools, across the board, all 9 makerspace leaders also noted that people were working or making with the tools available. And that's my dog. He's very excited about this as well. Okay, hold on one moment as I'm just gonna hold on one second. Apologies for that. Okay. And so people are working and making, they're seeing the different machines in this space. Now, another interesting thing that came from the data collection was that when asked about the users and also the staff in the space, there was this kind of intentional blurring that Makerspace leadership was trying to achieve. That is, when I asked them, as someone that's building out the VR environment, how could I tell which person is a student, which person is a staff member? Many of them mentioned that they were intentionally trying to blur the two so that they wouldn't have folks wearing a lanyard or a name tag. And so I thought it was a very interesting way for folks to say that they want to communicate inclusion to students by making it look like there isn't a type of like hierarchy happening. And of course, for the last bit of what is being seen, many folks noticed that there were projects on display. And the projects ran the gamut from research projects to personal gifts, and of course, pop culture products as well. As one of the participants, they said they mentioned that you want to present projects that give people what they want. So they talked a lot about projects from Doctor Who, from Mandalorian, right? Baby Yoda, also known as the child. So they had these different elements in terms of what you can see. Now, smell. I think this was my favorite question because it was just so interesting to see, or not to see, but to envision what people would smell in a makerspace. And the main smell that came up was something that was burning. Now, not like burning like there is a fire, but burning in terms of different materials. So the smell of like a campfire or burning wood came up a bunch for folks that worked in a makerspace with a laser cutter, and also the smell of burning plastic. So many folks mentioned the smell of something sweet like syrup or waffles. And this makes sense considering that PLA filament for a 3D printer is a byproduct of corn and sugar. So it emits this kind of sweet smell as well. So you smell a lot of burning things in this makerspace, and it'll be interesting to kind of try to replicate that in the VR environment or within the space where the VR is taking place. And then the last bit was disinfectant, which wasn't quite surprising to see. I also want to sneak in a couple of honorable mentions in terms of smells, because I thought they were super kind of interesting. The first one was generic library smell, which for some reason is a very vague phrase, but for me, I just kind of get exactly what they're saying. The other one is Bojangles. One of the locations was close to a Bojangles, so many of the users and students would bring Bojangles into the space, so that in a sense created kind of the smellscape of it. And then another participant just was like, it smells like a lot of things. It's project du jour, whatever you're close to or whatever's happening during that day. So that sight, that smell, and then the sound, nothing surprising here. You hear a lot of conversation, you hear a bunch of machines, and also you hear sometimes music as well. Okay, so as the PI and as a researcher, these early findings make me really happy. And the reason being is because this is exactly what we need in order to build out the second part of this project. So we're feeling good, we're making good progress. This is awesome. But, and there are really other interesting themes that are emerging from the data that are quite surprising to me that I wanted to share right now. So two things that come to mind in terms of the major themes are tension and also affect. Okay, so when we were developing the interview guide for this project, I thought it was a pretty benign ask to ask leadership to think about what these defining features are, right? What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? But what we were finding was as we were asking them to articulate these different defining features, it was a bit of a tense moment because in the act of defining, they're also extending a value statement that they have personally. I mean, values around what they consider to be making, consider values around their pedagogy. So at that spot, there was this kind of tension of like, okay, this is a generic makerspace, but I'm also revealing something about myself that I'm articulating at the moment, and it's a little uncomfortable. So for example, with the 3D printers, across the board, all 9 said that there is a 3D printer in this generic makerspace. However, there were about 3 participants that wanted me to know that they're qualifying that a bit. So they would say something along the lines of, I see a 3D printer in this makerspace, but I also want you to know that a 3D printer doesn't make it a makerspace, and that makerspaces can exist without them. So there was a lot of kind of tension around how they were defining the space and how it aligns with them personally. Also, there were moments of tension that arised with the questions that I thought were just super fascinating, where I asked participants, you know, can you tell me more about the materials or the technologies in this space? And so I remember a participant saying, well, you see 3D printers as a technology, you see a laser cutter, but I also want to be mindful that a needle is a technology, paper is a technology as well. So it was very interesting to see this kind of tension emerge when we're prompting Makerspace leadership to do the work of definition, which I thought was fascinating. And the last bit for the tension piece that goes along with envisioning a generic makerspace is that participants were toggling between these different domains to create this space that they're talking about. And many times it toggled between their idealized space and a space that they are currently experiencing. So one of the questions in the interview where I feel kind of a tonal shift in the dynamic is where I asked this question. I asked participants, all right, I have an idea of what it looks like in there. I need a better idea of what the users and students look like in there for the VR environment. Can you tell me more about the racial, the gender, the age demographics of the folks in there? And you could kind of feel this moment of like, oh, okay, we're going to talk about race, I suppose. We're going to talk about gender. And it's interesting because folks have responded in this way, saying, well, in my idealized environment, so in this environment, everyone is diverse. There's a diversity of age, there's diversity of race and gender. But in my experience, that's not what it has been. And so it's interesting to kind of get a sense of how this envisioned space is being created from these different domains that they're pulling from. And so that's the big part of this early finding theme around tension that we're further exploring. And the last finding that I want to share has to do with affect. And it's so fascinating to see how affect as a non-linguistic force that shapes the way that people move around a place and how they behave is coming up so readily in the findings, in the data. And so an example of this is when we ask makerspace leaders at the beginning to describe this room that they've recognized as a makerspace, many times they don't start off by naming the different tools or people, but instead they're describing different feelings. So they would say, oh, I look in the room and it's very open. There are good vibrations. It's bright, it's inviting. And so at times we found ourselves having to retrack and re-ask the question, but asking for more specificity around, okay, that's great, good vibrations, but what does that look like? How could you tell there are good vibrations happening in this space? And so that leads to kind of the last bit for the early findings, which is a challenge that I'm kind of excited about. And it's that as we think about this VR environment, not only are we looking to create this 360 emulation of the sight, sound, and smell, but we're also going to try to reflect a set of affects or feelings that are also readily attributed to a makerspace, which I think will be complicated, but I think fun as well. So those are our early findings. We got our sight, scent, and smell ready to go. These are some emerging themes that we wanted to share today in terms of the debrief. Now, in terms of what happens next, we are going to continue with our coding and analysis portion of phase 1. And then we're going to compile a list and then hand it over to Horizon Productions, which is a local VR development group. And we're going to begin building out the environment. Also, last bit that I want to plug in is that we're also looking to recruit a new PhD student into the Equity and Making Lab. So if that's you or if you know someone who may be interested, please feel free to reach out. I will say that applications close in 2 weeks. But I mean, if it's of interest, please let me know. I'd be happy to contact you. All right, so that is it. Thank you again for hanging in there with me with my barking dog, Brewer, who's right here right now. But I'd like to open it up for any questions and answers. Well, questions, and I will respond.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Maggie. That was really great. I know we're all waiting with great anticipation for an update to your research. And as Cliff points out, dogs are always welcome.
Oh, thanks, Cliff.
And so the floor is now open for questions. We have a little bit of time and can probably fit in a couple of questions here. So please type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll take them now. And I also just want to point out that I did put in the chat the link to the Equity in the Making website, which I believe has that posting for the PhD student in there, I believe. So if you want more information about that, please visit that site. While we're waiting to see what questions we might get from our audience, I was curious to know, did you detect any distinctions about the kinds of reactions that people had, the kinds of descriptors, depending upon where the makerspace was located on campus?
Yes, so for this project, we specifically focused on makerspaces that were open to all disciplines. So it's public facing. Usually they're in a library in a kind of agnostic disciplinary space like that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it did vary. We had a couple of makerspace leaders participate that were from the same institution, and it was remarkably different. We had one that had a entrepreneurship makerspace and also one with an art-based one. And although they were different in many ways, they overlapped quite consistently.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I'll be curious to see how that plays out as well in your research as you continue to dig into all of this. I see that we're at time now, and I want to be mindful and respectful of your time and our attendees' time. So I'm going to propose now bringing the live portion of the presentation, or the public portion, to a close. I will turn off the recording and just invite any attendees who are still with us to hang around. And if you raise your hand, I'll be happy to turn on your microphone, and you can ask a question live or make a comment or just join the conversation. And with that, I just really want to express our gratitude to you, Maggie, for coming and sharing your preliminary results of this really interesting research. And thank you to all of our attendees for spending some time with us here today at CNI. We hope to see you back soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.